hear that? That's the sound of revolting peasants. Hello there, Oskar from Virtual Factually here. Today I have another context video for you, and in this case I'll be talking about peasants and social class as we can see them in fight books and related sources from late 15th and early 16th century Germany. Now, the idea for this video was brought up by a very interesting online discussion a while back. I think it was Tlusty who started it, about how we should read these mentions of peasant-like techniques in fencing manuals. And some people would argue like, hey, if it says that something is peasant-like, it doesn't necessarily mean it is bad, but that is rather more an indication that it's more fundamental type of strike. And others were arguing like, hey, but there was some very serious classist discourse going on in medieval texts, so you can't really ignore that either. And I figured, hey, that would be interesting to dive a bit further into that. So I did, and I'll be presenting my findings over here. So pretty much the question is here, how should we be reading the remarks on peasants in fight books and related sources? Now, what I won't be doing is going into the modern implications of that. So I'm not going to be telling you like the people who wrote these fight books thought that peasant strikes were bad, therefore you shouldn't do them either. That's not what I'm going to be talking about. But I would like to really get into what were the people writing fight books and those other sources thinking. How did they see the peasants, and why did they then portray them in such a way? So I think the short answer would be that yes, the social attitudes that these fencing masters had and many others in medieval society around them did probably influence their view of peasants a bit, and we can't really look at how they talk about peasant strikes without that context. However, it's slightly more complicated than you would expect. For starters, I think that when a fencing master talks of a peasant strike, it's not necessarily the type of fencing that a peasant would do, at least not always. I think that is not the case that peasants are bad, therefore any type of fencing that a peasant does is bad. So rather it would be, peasants are considered to be uncivilized, therefore uncivilized, uncouth fencing would be peasant-like. And that might very well explain some of the mentions that we find in some fight books. For instance, especially Leküchner tends to mention peasants a couple times. He, of course, repeats the part in the Zornhau where he says that the Zornhau is pretty much a simple peasant strike. Now, in this case, it might refer to a very simple fundamental play, but if we look at some of the other places where he does mention peasants, you do get a slightly different image. For instance, in the Wecker, there is a particular play where if someone who strikes peasantly, then you have to really beat it aside and cut someone really hard through the neck or on the belly. So either kill them or hurt them really badly. So in this case, it's very much considered foul play, a faux pas, something you don't really do in a fectula or in any type of fight, hitting really hard without any control. So in this case, Leküchner is really saying like, hey, a bad uncontrolled strike is a really uncivilized, poor way of fencing, and therefore it is what a peasant would do. Therefore it is peasant-like. Now, I think that you can see a very similar attitude in some of the other manuals that mention these peasants. So on one hand, you do find this idea that peasants will be using very fundamental, simple techniques, and at the same time you also have this fear that the skilled fencer will be beaten by someone with simple, fundamental techniques. I think Debringer writes about it, that sometimes someone is beaten by a peasant who uses simple strikes. Bauernfeind mentions the Paurenschlag or Paurenstreich again, giving a counter to what you can do when someone fences like that. And of course we cannot also forget the many mentions of Fechtschule, where there is this parable of a peasant who goes into the list and then beats the skilled fencers with simple crosscuts. So what speaks from these sources is, on one hand, yes, very much peasant fencing is simple and uncomplicated and fundamental, but at the same time it's also really not something you do in a civilized context. This is not how we do things over here. And that's interesting. Let's dive into that a little bit more. So where do these attitudes towards peasants come from? Well, An easy answer would be to look to the very traditional way in which medieval society was ordered, at least in theory. You'd have three orders. So the first order would be those who pray, the clerical class. Then the second one would be those who fight, the nobility. And third, those who work. So in a very early medieval society, that would be the peasant class. This does not really fully explain it, especially since this society of orders become really more complicated during the High and later Middle Ages. And this, of course, has everything to do with the emergence of cities. Now, and that's really interesting thing, and I think the point of my video is going to come in, that is the rift that exists between the city and the countryside. The city pretty much screws up the perfect divine order of society that was created with the three estates. Instead, you get a place where people from all these different orders intermingle and start making their own social classes, rather based on wealth rather than their function within society. So there are serious boundaries between, on one hand, the countryside and on the other hand, the city. The city, for instance, was not ruled necessarily by nobility alone. It was ruled by a patrician class that consisted of a couple of nobles who had their primary residence in the city, and a group of the richest merchant capitalists, and sometimes even some of the richer craftsmen and business owners from that city. So the cities were already, with governments, really different from what people envisioned the perfect medieval society to be like. Now, these cities were also separated from the surrounding countryside by legal boundaries. A city had its own law codes, its own jurisdiction generally, and was considered to be very much a different place from the surrounding countryside. Generally speaking, those living in a city were generally not given that much freedom to interact with those from the countryside as well. I mean, going to the countryside perfectly fine, but owning a business outside the city was generally frowned upon, and in some cases even forbidden. Having any sort of political power outside of the city was generally not something that happened to anyone other than the nobility that had the residence in the city. So there's very clear economic, social and legal boundaries separating the city from the countryside. And that creates the peasant class pretty much as the other in the case of urban elites. So what I'm trying to say here is if someone from an urban elite, and then specifically talking fencing masters in this case, so people who were writing for those urban elites, when they mention peasants, is usually talking about the other, someone who is not from the city, therefore does things differently. And sometimes that can mean that that other, the peasant, is uncivilized, uncouth. Their fencing is not how we do things over here in our civilized fecula type of way. In other cases, it's very interesting, the peasants are sometimes even drawn up as noble savages. So in the case of the peasant who beats a fencing master, it's usually used as a parable during Lutheran sermons, where the peasant is seen as someone who's using very simple, strong fundamentals to win a fight. And in the same way, a Lutheran Protestant should use the same simple arguments to come on top when it comes to the fight against the devil or the Catholics, for that matter. So very much, yes, the peasant class was seen as the other in medieval and early modern urban society. This development of this attitude is sharpened even more by events coming in the last quarter of the 15th and the first quarter of the 16th century, and then talking about the Peasant Revolts. What is happening is that from roughly 1450 onwards, you see that there is an economic growth in Germany, a population growth, and as per usual, it's usually the lower classes that tend to suffer from this. Those who are dependent on wage labor and the rights to land tend to draw the short stick if prices and rents go up. So this creates a very great social instability, especially on the countryside. And this, from about 1476 onward, leads to a series of peasant revolts in Germany that culminates in the Great Peasant Revolt of 1524 and 25. Now, of course, the peasant revolts themselves sharpen the divide between the urban elites and those who live in the countryside. So a very quick edit to this. Now, this sharp divide between the city and the countryside might, and I say might, explain some of the downright hostility that we sometimes find from fencing masters in fight books. Take, for instance, the plate from Codex Wallenstein, where it is shown how to pretend to cut a peasant's throat in order to rob him. Or, for instance, the name Bauernfeind, which literally translates to enemy of peasants, which pops up all over Austria and southern Germany around this last quarter of the 15th century. It might have something to do with it, or it might not. This is very tentative, but I did want to mention it after all. Now, on that subject, what I'm going to say from here on is also very much a generalization of what is happening. The peasant revolts and their implications deserve an entire video of their own, and possibly quite more, but I do not have the time or space to really go in depth, so I'm going to keeping it very general from here on. But it's especially in the countryside where this divide is most clearly felt. During the peasant revolt, the peasants target the rich landowners, yes, but some of the impoverished nobility of the countryside joins them during the revolt. And you see that the peasant revolt also targets the rich merchant capitalists who tend to live in cities. So in some cases the peasant revolt is a conflict between people in the countryside who do not profit from an economic boom and those in the cities who do. So peasant revolts during the late 15th, early 16th century, like the Bundschuh and the Great Peasant Revolt of 1525, tend to sharpen this divide between city and countryside even further, leading to these attitudes on peasants to solidify, I suppose. Now, I think this would need a lot further research to really corroborate what I'm saying here. I'm mostly basing this on a little bit of scholarship, a couple of really good books on the subject, but this is worth a PhD at least. However, if you like it, do not forget to leave a like and let me know in the comments, and otherwise don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Finally, a shout out to my patrons. You guys voted to me to get this context video out first. It was a lot of fun making it, so thanks for that. And otherwise, stay safe. I'll catch you in the next one. Cheers.